Okay, so when we're talking about biological harms that we would consider kind of external to the brain, things that don't necessarily have to do with brain activity, but things that you can do to yourself or or you can do which biologically might impact you. Um, what we're going to focus on today in this area is the idea of perinatal risks. Now, perinatal risks are, we call them perinatal because these are risk factors, these are problems that can happen at or around the time of birth. And a lot of these risk factors have to do not only with how a baby gets delivered and born, but what behaviors the mother did when she was pregnant that might put the baby at high risk for developing problematic behavior. So, some examples of some perinatal risks that research has shown have a link to delinquent and problematic behavior later in life. Things like high risk maternal behavior. So, when you're thinking of that, what people have found is that, for example, mothers who smoke while they're pregnant, drink, who use illegal drugs during pregnancy, all of those things have been linked to problematic behaviors in a child's development. Trauma during birth delivery, during, trauma during delivery, during birth is another example. If for whatever reason the birthing process is especially traumatic, if the baby spends a lot of time in intensive care, all of those things have been found to have some small link to problematic behavior later on. And babies who are born with a lower than normal birth weight have also been, if you follow them later on into life, overall, again, these are averages, they tend to do a little bit worse in terms of things like having attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, tend to report a lot more impulsive behavior. Babies who have, more and more of these perinatal risks tend to become more delinquent and eventually get into more problems in terms of violent, aggressive criminal behavior, violent offending. And again, these are risk factors, so any one of them might not necessarily be enough to cause any of these problem behaviors later. But people have found that as you build up more and more of these, and as other environmental problems kind of mount on top of them, all of these things tend to add up and create a fairly strong link between these perinatal risks and problem behaviors later on in life. So you can imagine how, for example, a mother who engages in high risk maternal behavior, who has a baby who's of a low birth rate, the baby's born into an impoverished household, single parent home, all of these different things, biological and environmental, can kind of combine to place the child at much, much higher risk. Now, this probably sounds a little depressing when you think about the fact that something that happens to you when you're an infant might have something to do with your delinquent behavior later in life. One of the good things about this area, looking at perinatal risks and biological harms, is the fact that in addition to identifying these risk factors, scientists have also developed policies and programs that can target these risk factors and help children who enter the world in these kind of circumstances. So this is an example of an area where biological theory and policy have actually intertwined to create effective programs. And mostly what we're talking about here is programs that are designed to improve early childhood parenting. So children who might have been brought into the world with all of these risk factors, if programs can be designed to really help the parents educate and bring these children up in a healthy, normal way, you can kind of combat some of those earlier risk factors. So a good example of that, which we'll go into a little bit later on in the course, but I want to talk about now because it's relevant, is something that got developed in the late 80s, early 90s, which we call nurse home visitation programs. So what these programs are, essentially how these programs happen, is high-risk pregnant women get identified for study to be part of these programs. And when we're talking about high-risk pregnant women, we're talking about young, sometimes teenage, single moms, women who this is their first pregnancy, women who don't have a lot of social supports, don't have parents or the father of the child necessarily in the picture to help them, women who are poorly educated, maybe don't have steady employment, falling at or below the poverty line, have displayed signs of alcoholism or drug abuse in the past. All of these things are things that you could say put a woman into a pool of being at high risk in terms of not only neglecting and maltreating their child, but high risk of developing a child who is going to have problems throughout their lives. So these women get identified during pregnancy, these high risk women, through a variety of different ways. And basically, what happens in this program is licensed nurses go and visit these pregnant women both during their pregnancy and in the first about 18 months of the infant child's life. And what they do with these women, it's kind of hard to define, but basically they teach these women how to be good mothers. They teach them during pregnancy things they should do to take care of their bodies, things they need to do to baby proof and get their house ready to have a child. Once the child is there, they teach them how to nurse the child. They teach them how to change and when to pick up a child, when to not pick up a child. All of these things that women who have more social supports, more education, more money could maybe read about, learn about, get help with on their own. These nurses come in and help these women through. Now, this program, this nurse home visitation program, got designed to target women who were at high risk for abusing their children. But the person who designed the program, the original nurse home visitation program, followed these women and their children up until the child was about 15, 17 years old, and recorded a number of different life outcomes for these kids. So not only were they healthy, but do they stay in school? Have they ever been arrested? Have they ever gotten in fights? All of this kind of behavior. And they track similar things for the mothers. How many other babies has the mother had? Has the mother been able to be employed? And basically what they found is that these nurse home visitation programs are actually really effective when you compare kids who went through this to single moms with kids who didn't. We know that not only do the mothers who go through these programs have much less high-risk behavior, but these babies who throughout the course of the study become teenagers have much less risky behaviors. They do less drugs, they smoke and drink less, they stay in school more, and they get arrested less. They don't commit as many violent, deviant, delinquent actions. So I wanted to give you this example because it's an example of a program that is fairly cheap, easy to run, and it targets these early childhood risk factors, which we know are so problematic, and seems like it's able to help them. It seems like it's able to combat these risk factors and lead to successful outcomes. So it's an example of biological theory meeting policy in a good way. Now, not everyone likes neobiological theories. I mean, as you saw in your book, this is really only a small part of any introduction to criminology class, and that's because not a lot of people spend a lot of time researching neobiological theories. When I say neobiological, I mean things in the 20th century and the 21st century now. And just to give you a couple things that have been listed as critiques, problems with neobiological theories. For the first one, we know that a lot of these studies that I've talked about today, studies with murderers and PET scans, or these nurse home groups, MRIs, any of these things, they're very expensive to conduct, these studies. So the sample sizes in them are very small. In the PET scan study that I showed you with the murderers' PET scan compared to the normal person's, it's only about 25 people, 25 murderers, convicted murderers in that study. So one of the critiques of that is we just don't know enough yet to make large claims about biology when you're only working with a really small sample of the total population. Another critique is the fact that for the most part when we study biological elements of crime, we're studying convicted, incarcerated offenders and comparing them to people who are not incarcerated. And as you know at this point, when you think about the funnel effect, you're eliminating a lot of people who commit crime if you're only focusing on incarcerated offenders. So one thing people don't like about some of these neobiological theories and how they're tested is the fact that there might be something different or unique about people who get caught and convicted and incarcerated for crime compared to all the other people that we know commit crimes and never really enter the system. So people would like it if we expanded this biological research beyond just incarcerated populations. The third critique in neobiological theory is a lot of these links that we're talking about, links between low birth weight and impulsivity, or links between prefrontal cortex functioning and, you know, personality disorders and violent behavior. All of these effects are indirect, meaning nobody is necessarily saying that these biological factors directly cause someone to commit crime. In fact, the causality here is very unclear. It's hard to tell, for example, just how much something like a traumatic birth actually has anything to do with future behavior. We know it maybe matters a little, but how much is the key here? How much does this actually impact you later on in life? How much does neurotransmitter functioning, low levels of serotonin, how much can you actually attribute that to criminal behavior? And that's very, very difficult to do, and it's one of the big critiques of this theory because they people who don't like neobiological theories think that there's just too much going on in a person's social and environmental life that can't really be accounted for in biological theories. And the fourth critique really has a lot to do with that, the fact that it's a very deterministic theory. And one thing that critics note is that a lot of people who have some of these risk factors, these biological correlates of crime, do not become criminal. A lot of people who were born with a low birth weight don't go on to become juvenile delinquents. A lot of people who have low levels of serotonin don't go on to become violent offenders. So there must be something else going on, and that's the big critique here. That the theories make it seem like these are much more causal and larger effects than they maybe really are. And it seems to be a very deterministic mindset that if you have these things wrong with you, you are going to commit crime. Critics of biological theories don't like this idea, and they think it's very important that we include other factors, these other things that must be going on to cause someone to commit crime, into the mix. Okay, so we're going to stop talking about biological theories of crime now, and in the next segment we will open up by talking about the next chapter of material, which is psychological theories of crime.